Welcome back. The title of this mini lecture is Enslavement in Brazil. And we're going to talk about 5 terms that, as you read more about this topic and you learn more about its complexities, these are good basics so that you can start to get an understanding of things. If you want to read more or learn more, there are many additional resources from which to base your understanding. Let's get into it. The first is numbers and institution. So, if you grew up in the United States, chances are when you think of the process of enslavement, you center it on the American South and individuals forcibly removed from Africa in the years prior to the American Civil War. While that is one part of thinking about the institution of slavery as it existed at that time, it's just one part. The majority of individuals from Africa who are forcibly removed and brought to the Americas will travel often through the Caribbean, with the final destination for them being Brazil. We're talking nearly 4 million individuals, somewhere between 40 and 60% of anyone who was forcibly removed from the continent of Africa. This is a sizable percentage. The other part of this is that we need to, when we're thinking about the process of enslavement, is think about it from an institutional perspective. Slavery has existed as an institution in varying forms and formats in states throughout the long arc of history. As it relates to Brazil, as an institution, right, we're looking at forms of chattel slavery here, where it, initially enslaved individuals have few to no rights, right? This kind of thing. They're not legally necessarily recognized as people. Some of that process will change later, but this is a very, very, very brutal process. All right. 2, plantations and space. Again, we need to, if we're thinking about the institution of slavery in Brazil, much like in the US, pull our understanding of it out of a singular space. Plantations and other large-scale agricultural sites are and were in Brazil and other areas often centers of enslaved labor. These are often going to be very much so black spaces. And that is an important part of understanding the complexities of not only the sort of regional makeup of a number of the different regions of colonial Brazil, but the other aspect to this is understanding that enslaved individuals don't simply exist within those particular large-scale rural spaces, that many of them will exist and will be enslaved really across the entirety of colonial Brazil. So if we're talking about urban areas, we're talking about forms of labor, it's not simply the idea of mass agricultural labor, but enslaved individuals and bodies existed, of course, across the entirety of colonial Brazil. 3rd, treatment. Treatment tended to vary depending on where an enslaved individual was, the conditions under which they were enslaved, the role their masters played, regional laws, regional authorities, issues of faith, really anything that you can think of. Death rates, of course, for enslaved individuals within the colony of Brazil were incredibly high, which contributed partly to why so many individuals here, of course, are brought into this particular process. But again, treatment varied, and it's important to understand the complexities of that. 4th, resistance, right? Resistance. Now, enslaved people, both in Brazil and in many, many, many particular areas, resisted enslavement on a daily basis. They fought back against their masters to achieve whatever form of dignity and agency that they could in the moment. This was a common and constant struggle for the defining of their own identities. Now, resistance takes many forms. It can be slowing down the pace of work. It can be breaking tools. It can be collective acts of resistance. It can be individual acts of resistance. It can be escaping. And it can be the process of establishing escaped communities or quilombos, as was prominent in Brazil. There are maroon communities in other parts of the Americas as well, which are good to take note of. 5th, abolition. The process of abolition in Brazil was just that. It was a process. There are a series of laws between the 1860s, 1870s, and all the way up through the final declaration where abolition takes effect in 1888. It's the last nation here necessarily to do this, but the process was one that had been taking place for some time. Now, even though abolition does, of course, come to Brazil, we should, of course, note the complexities, the role that race play within the country, both in the late 19th century and the early 20th century and through the mid 20th century. Brazil, much like many other Latin American nations, was a nation dialoguing on the role of race as it related to national identity at that time. The late 19th century is a time period in which you are seeing widespread immigration to a number of nations across Latin America. And so questions about race and whiteness, because of the fact that you're getting so many different immigrants from European nations. This is a time period also in which race laws and emphasis again on even eventually eugenics, right, is going to be sort of a thing as well. Whiteness is going to really influence Brazilian sort of concepts of identity. But by the 1920s, 1930s, early 1940s, you will see a number of Brazilian writers and scholars, including Gilberto Freire, who will speak out on Brazilian identity and its connections to mixed racial ancestry, and will push back against those earlier sort of racialized, sort of whiteness connotations. But that's a dialogue and it's a process and it's very difficult. And that idea of race and sort of acceptability within Brazilian identity is a dialogue that continues for a very long time. Thank you so much.